Welcome to Actual Faith. My name is Jeremy DeSpain, and this channel is committed to building the faith of Christians through a biblical worldview. And I am with Ryan Pauly. Ryan, would you please maybe just take a moment before we get started with today's broadcast? Maybe talk to us a little bit about yourself, your interest in theology, Christian apologetics, and your YouTube channel. I know you have a channel yourself, and I'd like to get to know you a little bit, introduce you to my audience before we get started with today's subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeremy, for having me on. I appreciate it. Looking forward to our conversation. Yeah, I kind of had an interesting journey. We'll talk a little bit about that into apologetics. But I was born and raised a Christian, grew up in a Christian home, went to college, studied theology in college, had no idea what apologetics was. And it wasn't until after I graduated with my degree in theology, I started working with students and realizing a lot of students were walking away from the faith. And why are they doing this? And I came to the conclusion, I don't think they actually understand Christianity. I don't think they actually know what they believe or really why they believe it. I still didn't know what apologetics was, and I thought, hey, I have to figure out how to get students to understand this thing, but I don't know how I'm going to do that. It wasn't until a little bit later that I was actually introduced to William Lane Craig through one of his debates, discovered apologetics, and that led me down this journey where I just fell in love with it. So I went back and I did my master's in Christian apologetics at Biola University. I'm now back at Talbot School of Theology getting my doctorate. And throughout this whole time as well, I started teaching high schoolers. So my story is I kind of am engaged in apologetics a few different ways. I'm a full-time high school teacher. I've been teaching for 12 years. 8 of those years have been full-time doing theology, apologetics, worldview, and ethics. And so that's my main full-time job. I'm also on staff with Maven. I help lead their apologetic, biblical, and worldview kind of mission trips, immersive experiences, training students, and then getting them out in the field and making them engage with these ideas. And then, as you mentioned, I also run my own nonprofit organization called Think Well. And with Think Well, that just is my kind of side ministry where I create YouTube content, interview a lot of people on my channel, create short videos, helping people engage and think well about the culture so that they can engage it well. And then I do speaking events and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the different ways in which I'm engaged with apologetics and my quick story on how I got there.
That's great. Well, thanks again, Ryan, for joining me today on my channel. And by the way, I just want to encourage you, if you're not subscribed to Actual Faith, maybe take a moment when we're done here and browse the channel, get to know some of the things that we do here on Actual Faith. And I'm going to provide a link in the description of this video for Ryan's channel as well, and some of the resources that he's involved with. He mentioned Maven, and of course, I also graduated from Biola. So we both have like interest, and it's kind of a special niche. Christian apologetics, just this branch of theology that helps us to understand Christianity at an evidential level. And I want to start there with that, by the way. You know, when we talk about faith, there are so many definitions of faith. And I'm kind of curious, how do you help students or people just recognize what faith is? How do you define it?
Yeah, well, that definitely is a word that has to be defined. And a lot of people are going to come at it in different ways. The most common approach is going to be something like a blind faith. You often hear within Christian circles taking a leap of faith. And so kind of one way I kind of engage students is say, okay, what does that mean to you? Right? When you say you're taking a leap of faith or you just have faith in God, what does that mean? And then I kind of shift it around. And right. So the way that I would define it, and I think the biblical definition of faith is trusting in things that we have good reason to believe are true. And so I think that we have good reason to believe that Christianity is true. I trust in God based on the evidence and the reasons that I have for him. And so I think that is a more biblically accurate definition of faith based on, the things that Jesus talked about. And we can go into those sort of examples, but I think that's what Jesus presented. I think that's what the book of John presents. I think that's what the beginning of the book of Luke presents. And so that would be, I think, what Jesus is trying to get people towards is, hey, based on what he did, the works of Christ, that we trust in him as Lord and Savior. And that's what faith looks like to me.
Yeah, on this channel, I use the tagline quite often that actual faith is trusting and believing the unknown because of the known.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, when you think about students that you've interacted with, some that maybe don't believe in God, which this is what we're going to tackle today, the topic of why people don't believe in God. And sometimes atheists will kind of make this claim that they don't exercise faith. What do you think about that claim yourself?
Yeah, it's definitely a common claim, and I think it's based on a false definition of faith. Richard Dawkins, famously put out, the quote of faith is believing in things for which you have no reason to believe are true, or faith is believing in something which goes contrary to evidence. And so there's often this kind of spectrum that people set up, which over here is like you have evidence, and then over here on this side you have faith. And so then the more evidence you have for something, the further away from faith you are. And so this is kind of a common way in which a lot of people think about it. And so it's like, look, I'm not closing my eyes and trusting. I'm trusting in the science. I'm trusting in evidence. Therefore, there's no faith. But in that sense, if you want to take kind of the definition we just talked about of faith is trusting in things you have good reason to believe are true, or trusting in something, as you mentioned, the unknown based on what is known, well, then everyone has faith to some degree or another. There are unanswered questions in every single religion and in every single worldview where we have scientific evidence or we have arguments that point to something, but then eventually there's like, hey, this is where I'm putting my trust in this answer. And I love the interaction. I don't know if you've seen it between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox. I love John Lennox. I named my son Lennox after John Lennox. But there's a part where Dawkins, in a debate that they had at the Veritas Forum, it's on YouTube, where Dawkins defines faith as believing in something contrary to evidence. And if you had evidence, you wouldn't need faith. And John Lennox just looks at Dawkins and says, Richard, do you have faith in your wife? And Richard Dawkins says, yeah, of course I do. And he goes, is there any evidence for that? And he goes, of course there is. And the whole audience just kind of erupts laughing. And then Dawkins goes, whoa, 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 whoa. He kind of like, pause, hold on a second. And the point that I think is interesting with that is to show that, look, you're trusting that your wife is faithful based on the way in which she's acted and good reasons in which she has been faithful over the years. But there still is that level of trust that you are having to put in it. And so I think in that sense, everyone has faith in something.
That's very good. I have not seen that interaction. I'll have to go back and take a look at that.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, thanks. As I think about young people that seem to be leaving the faith and or maybe just aren't even established in the faith, as a teacher, you said that you teach high school. I'm sure that you've noticed this in your interactions with young people, but why do you suppose that they are losing their faith, or maybe they have no faith, so to speak, to begin with?
Yeah. That's a good question. And just kind of give a little context too, that the school that I've been teaching at the last 8 years, when I arrived there 8 years ago, it's an international Christian school. So we're private, but it is mostly international students from China, at least when I first started. When I first started, it was about 70% non-Christian students were at this Christian school. Now we're about 35% non-Christian. So there's definitely been a kind of a change in our demographics, but I've had a lot of non-Christian students over my 8 years there. And I think that, man, if you had to boil down kind of why people don't believe, I think that it's kind of a range of things based on a few common misunderstandings. And that's where it is. It's often misunderstandings. There's misunderstandings of what faith is, as we talked about. I think there's misunderstandings of who God is or what we trust in. So I have a lot of students that will come to my class and say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. And it's like, well, guess what? We believe in science at this school too. You just came from biology class. This isn't an either or. And so I think that a lot of people have this false dichotomy approach. A lot of students, I should say, have this false dichotomy approach where we trust the science or we believe in God. And I think some of this stems from just being dumped this idea that science explains everything and therefore just follow the true science and religion is kind of ridiculous. I think Christians sometimes can kind of push students in this way as well, where I think that sometimes we create this brand of Christianity that seems to be anti-science. Now, there's definitely a debate on this, and so I'm not, picking a side necessarily here, but like the young earth, old earth creationism debate, right? Some people say, look, if you're going to be a Christian, you have to be a young earth creationist. You have to believe the earth is 6,000 years old. You have to believe these things. And so now you have your faith, which says you have to believe 6,000-year-old young earth creationism. And then you go off to college, and college is teaching an old universe, an ancient universe, an old earth, and this sort of stuff. And then it's forcing students to feel like they have to pick. And I heard one person say this, and I thought it was fascinating that, like, if all we're giving, now there's good young earth arguments that you can give someone to ground them in them, but if all we're doing is kind of a Sunday school answer to where your reason for believing the Bible is true and that there, was a talking snake and, that kind of stuff is because a parent teaching a Sunday school class told you so, and you have that to compare against a PhD professor who has published many articles and defended those articles for their views, and the student is only left with that comparison, why are we surprised that they're siding with the professor? And the issue is that's not all that Christianity has to offer. And I would argue that you don't have to be a young earth creationist to be a Christian. I think there's smart Christians that fall on both sides of that debate, and you don't have to give up your faith just to accept an old earth. So I think that's another kind of category where kind of in the science and faith issue where a lot of students struggle is going to be feeling like they have to pick between the two and they kind of weigh those out. And then obviously I think the last one and the biggest one in our culture today is just kind of the issues related to gender and sexuality and kind of the way that Christians are approaching that, the way that Christians seem to be hateful, intolerant, bigoted. And, I don't kind of want to be part of that group or not understanding a biblical sexual ethic. I think it's not taught super well in a lot of the places I am. Most of the students that I interact with, and I kind of go over a theology of sexuality, a theology of the body, they're surprised, they're shocked. These are kids that have been born and raised in the church and Christian homes, and it's like they've never heard this kind of stuff before. And so again, if we are not talking about these issues as a church, as Christians, we're not giving them a strong biblical foundation to stand on, then it becomes very difficult for them to stand up against the cultural pressures that are pushing on them so strongly almost every day of their lives. And so I think those cultural issues, scientific issues, and just having a misunderstanding of what Christianity really is, I think leads a lot of students to either not believe, think it's ridiculous, or walk away.
Yes. Well, I know yourself, I guess, really working towards your doctorate, being a teacher, now as a parent, I'm sure a member of a church. When you think about this, being established in the faith and growing through some of this yourself, do you have any suggestions for church leaders, for parents to kind of insulate themselves with faith, with understanding what the issues are? How can we do a better job equipping students so that when they reach an age to make a decision to go to college, not all of them will go to a Christian college or university. Some may go off to secular work, and sometimes you hear them lose their faith. How can we do a better job in helping them with that? I know you mentioned some things, but maybe we can just bring it down to some very essential thoughts.
Yeah. I think here's some practicals. I think that's so good. I think number one is I think that we, a lot of the approach that a lot of people take is the idea of like inoculation versus isolation. We sometimes have had this idea that we can isolate students from these ideas, from these things, and that's what's going to keep them safe. Versus we recognize with like viruses or whatever, like we inoculate, we give someone a flu shot and that protects them from the flu. And I think that if we can inoculate our students, that we can expose them to these lies to then help them build a defense against them so that when they go off to college and they're not under our protection and they're exposed, they've already been exposed and they can stand up against it. And so I've personally experienced this in the many hundreds of high school students that I've taught that have now gone off to secular universities, and their professors start arguing that God doesn't exist or that Christianity is false or these sort of views. And they message me back and they're like, hey, Mr. Pauly, that my professor tried to use such and such argument to show that God doesn't exist. But here's where his flaw was in that argument. It's like, because that was an argument I exposed them to when they were with me. So I think that's one big thing that we can do is just expose that. I think, practically in the church, that means like, look, if we're teaching through a book of the Bible and there's kind of an issue there, like why not just quickly throw in a brief theology of something or a brief apologetic to defend it? If it doesn't seem maybe like it's relevant. I know one youth pastor that in every kind of email to parents, there's kind of a recommended resource. Hey, we're going to be talking about such and such thing. Here's some resources that kind of go along with it. Hey, here's a YouTube video, or here's a ministry that you can follow, trying to always give parents resources to then be able to work through with their kids. And so there's different ways, whether it's an equipping class, a Sunday school class, whether it's just a small little part of a sermon. You don't have to do a whole apologetic series. But if you're teaching through like 1 Corinthians and it talks about marriage or something, or you're talking about Ephesians 5, like give them a theology of marriage and address the cultural issues that come up and why the biblical view of marriage is the way it is and why it's not arbitrary. And so I think those are some of those things of like, start exposing students. And so almost every day in my classroom, I'm showing my students something I saw on Twitter, something I saw on the internet, and saying, hey, what do you think about this? Hey, here's how I responded. How would you respond? And so that when they go out from me, maybe they might hear something that I didn't get a chance to expose them to. But if I've exposed them to, in the 3 years that they're in my class, if I've exposed them to 100 different false ideas, well, then if some false idea comes up when they are not with me that they've never heard about, their tendency is to think, they're not going to think, oh my goodness, there's probably no answer to this. Oh my goodness, now I'm completely stumped. They're probably going to think, hey, Mr. Probably has a response to this one too.
Mhm.
and then to come back to the parent or the pastor or the teacher and say, hey, I just heard this and I've never heard that before. What do you think? And so again, making us people also, and the very practical, is people that they trust, where instead of Googling an answer, they're going to come back to you because they want that kind of relationship, and they see someone that you are an authority, that you have an answer, and they come back to you when they have those questions.
Yes, that's very good. I think it's wise, you'd mentioned, to share different views when you're up against maybe something that you know has multiple views. I think we all have our tendencies, whether it's a denominational tie or maybe we're in circles. You mentioned young earth versus old earth creationism. There are many topics that we can pick where people just get hung up, and sometimes they only hear one side of it. And I think it's important that we share multiple views. I like the idea of making sure that we provide resources. And I think that's what is valuable about the apologetics community, is not all about that we are the ones that are evidentialists, so to speak, and that there are other Christians out there that just take blind leaps of faith. I think, all of us base our Christianity on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But ultimately, sometimes we don't know how to articulate that. We don't know where to look for the evidence. In some of our circles, we may have grown up thinking that to be academic means that you're trying to move away from God. And that's just not the case. These are sometimes just false dichotomies, as you'd mentioned earlier, that we have thought maybe science and faith have no relation, or, academia and faith. And unfortunately, we've handed over some of our brightest institutions to secularism, and then we wonder why we're losing our students to that. And I think that there's this old adage that fear, or that truth does not fear bad ideas. We learn to face those head on, and we learn how to answer those hard questions. And in those moments where we really don't know how to overcome those objections, then we continue to pray, we continue to seek God, and we know that there's truth behind it. We just often don't know when we're going to stumble across that. So with that being said, it kind of leads me into my next question, because I know that it's not just students leaving the faith. It's not that there are young minds that have been brainwashed by secularism or the other way around. I think that's just an easy game to play on both sides. The reality is that there are people that struggle with big questions about why they don't believe God exists, why they might consider themselves an atheist, an agnostic, seeking, and that's why some maybe that believe in spiritualism move into New Age. There's so many facets that people really move into just because they're struggling. So since we're talking about God and these hurdles that people are having, let me ask you, what have you found to be the number one reason why people generally don't believe in God?
Yeah, man, that's a hard question, but I think there's like a category. And then I'm becoming more and more convinced that there's this kind of a more specific topic within that category. And so kind of the number one thing that you always hear from apologists is the reason why is because the problem of evil, right? Of why would a good God allow pain, evil, and suffering in this world? And that's one of the most difficult objections to respond to, because it's often so emotional, but that's often one that you hear, I think, more often than not. But what I've kind of been seeing even recently, and as I've been focusing on this, I see it popping up more and more as kind of the subcategory of why God allows evil is kind of the hiddenness argument against God, and it's kind of more framed of kind of in two ways of like, if God is really there, why does he still remain so hidden? Why doesn't he make his existence more obvious? I've been talking to some students, and one in particular that kind of has that argument of like, look, I want to believe. And if God loves me and he wants me to believe in him, why doesn't he just show himself to me? And so the fact that God has remained hidden, part of that is God hasn't cured the suffering that we go through. So there's the problem of evil. But God also just hasn't shown himself to me. If God wanted me to believe, he would just have to appear right in front of me, say, I'm God, here I am. He doesn't do that. Therefore, I have good reason to believe that he's not real. So he's not answering my prayers. He's remaining distant. He's not showing up in front of me. He's remaining hidden. I just heard a testimony of another atheist that was suffering from depression and anxiety and prayed that God would heal him from that. He wasn't healed. And so it's like, all right, then God's not there. And so I think that that's kind of it seems to just keep popping up more recently over and over again, is this kind of argument from divine hiddenness that that there should be no what some people call unresistant non-believers or non-resistant non-believers, those shouldn't exist. The fact that they do exist, there's people out there saying, God, where are you? I'd believe if you were there, and God doesn't show up, kind of is evidence against the existence of God. And so I think just his way of not responding, not answering, not showing up, and not curing the evil and suffering of our world, I think is kind of one big category to more specific of some of the reasons I think why a lot of people don't believe in him.
All right, so give me your elevator speech of how you answer that. Somebody's talking to you and say, hey, here's the deal, Ryan. I am struggling. It seems that I have been seeking God and he is not answering me. I mean, just give me the quick answer.
Oh man, I don't know where to go with a quick answer. And it so depends. But there's a few things. Number one, I would say this. There's different... one book I have calls it Faith Paths, and that is, how do we know what is real and what are we putting our faith in? And so the question is I think that this objection often comes what the book calls an experiential faith path, that I believe what is true based on what I experience, versus what I think is what we started this conversation with is that's an evidential faith path. I believe what is true based on what the evidence says. And the reason this leans more towards an experiential faith path is it's like, look, I prayed, I didn't experience God, or I felt like God wasn't listening, therefore he wasn't listening. And so we come to a conclusion based on what is true, based on what I feel. And I think it's easy to say, look, have you ever had a time in your life where you felt like someone was mad when they weren't mad? Or when you felt like something would be bad and it was actually good, or where your feelings were just wrong? And I think everyone would have to say, yeah, there are times where my feelings were wrong. And so like, okay, then is this the right path to be on, where you are basing what is true based on how you feel or based on an experience that you have? Should we instead base our faith and base our truth on what is evidentially supported to be true? And so I think that's one thing, is I think it often comes from that wrong kind of experience. I might also push back and say, hey, is it possible that God has revealed himself in ways that you are unaware? And is it even possible that you are expecting even too much, right? If God has created the entire universe, is it possible, then this is where people look at it different. Some people go through pain and depression, and they see how, a therapist comes into their life to provide, relief from that, and how God has provided all these ways for them to reconnect and to find healing in this. And that's God's common grace. That's God's way of answering their prayer. And versus someone else that says, well, I still have the depression, therefore there's no God. And so sometimes it's like, are we just missing how God is answering prayers? Are we expecting a different answer? We want immediate healing. God has a future healing in mind. And so is it possible that God does exist? He is there. He's answering, maybe just not in the way that we want. And so we can't say definitively, because God hasn't shown up right in front of me, I don't believe, or that therefore he doesn't exist. There may be a reason why God is not showing up right in front of you. And then if I can push back one more thing, this is a long elevator ride. This is a 40 level building. It's like, look at Jesus. Jesus, who is God, came down in human flesh, stood right in front of people, and they still did not believe. And this leads back maybe to even the first question, and that's because not everyone believes based on evidence. People sometimes don't believe in God because of a volition. They just don't want to. I've had students say this to me. I had one student that flat out said, if I admit that God exists, then I will have to stop doing the things I want to do. That's not an intellectual rejection. That is, I just don't want to change my life. And sometimes we are attracted to sin and we just don't want God. And so even if God showed up in front, like Jesus did to people, they still rejected him and denied him. And so I don't think we can definitively say, yes, if God showed up, I would believe. It's possible they're just asking for a burden of proof that is unbearable or unprovable, because they really just have a different reason why they don't want to believe. But in short, I believe that everyone who would freely come to believe in God will be given that opportunity.
I agree. And it does come down to asking sort of this question of how much evidence is enough. And by the way, I know it wasn't fair for me to ask you to give an elevator speech, but
so hardest objection.
I really just wanted to get to the core of it and kind of challenge your heart a bit. But I wouldn't want you to ask me the same question. But I do know that this is something to think about, because sometimes we might ask ourselves, how much evidence is enough? And as you mentioned, there are things around us that we can see evidence of God. And we talk about this, whether it's through natural theology in apologetics, all the way down to, as you mentioned, something historical as Jesus of Nazareth and his claims, and all the way to his resurrection. And so certainly God is not hiding,
Right.
but we can sometimes feel that way, as you
Right.
mentioned. And we need to be careful about our feelings because they can deceive us. But there's something powerful about evidence and feelings, these things that work together. There's not one specific philosophy of knowing things. There are many ways in which we know things. And I think it's important that all of those work together as sort of this cumulative case. And we miss that. Sometimes we look at it as sort of this, these factions that, there's just this one nail in the coffin, so to speak, that just gives us all the answers. And ultimately, it's understanding truth as a whole, faith as a whole, and who God is. When we're talking about belief in God, it's one thing to get someone to believe in God, and then understanding who God is. It's even more challenging because as Christians, we believe Jesus is the Christ, not just Jesus, the historical person from Nazareth. So there's a lot to be overcome, understandably, but often the Lord shows us that.
Yeah. Now, when you were in the Biola program, I'm assuming you had Clay Jones for Why Does God Allow Evil?
Yes.
Yeah. So Clay has a quote in that class that I it's just stuck with me, where he says, God gives enough evidence so that those who want to believe will have their beliefs justified, but he does not give so much evidence that those who do not want to believe will have to feign loyalty.
That's
and
right.
I think that's so true, is that God has revealed himself in enough way that you can have justification for belief in him, but not so much. Like, God could make his existence so obvious that everyone in the world says, okay, fine, God, you exist. But the question is that his goal? Is his goal for everyone to just say, okay, God, you exist, fine? No, his goal is that he wants people to seek after him. He wants people to be in relationship with them. And there's a lot of testimonies of people that I was just listening to one this morning of someone dealing with suicidal thoughts and depression and anxiety, that said they actually saw that they prayed for healing. God didn't heal. And they actually saw that as an answer to prayer, because it was in that they had to continually seeking after God, because God doesn't want to just fix us. God wants a relationship with us. And so sometimes, they saw that as a way that here's God wanting a relationship with me in a daily interaction to trust him in my pain, versus just take away my pain where I'm going to feel like I don't need him anymore. And other people say, well, because I didn't get fully healed, I'm out. And so there's just that different perspective where it's like, look, there's enough reason to believe and have belief justified for those who want, but not so much that you have to feign loyalty for those who didn't want to.
Right, as though God is a genie that just answers our prayers whenever we ask them, or he doesn't have deeper wisdom and understanding in how he answers our prayers or helps us. So you're absolutely correct. Or I've had conversations with atheists that said, if God could make himself known, I still wouldn't want to know him, almost as though relationships, we know people all the time that live in bitterness and basically say, you're dead to me. And if God became real to them, it's almost as though he would be dead to them still. So as you mentioned, some of these things, when it comes down to it, has to do with whether or not we actually want to follow Christ, whether we want to follow God, whether we actually have a desire to know him. And so I know it goes levels deep, but I appreciate you answering that question. It's important for us to think about, because you're correct. People struggle with that. So let me ask you then, have you ever had a big moment of doubt in your personal life that you've had to walk through? And if so, if you don't mind, maybe share with us what that was, and then maybe how you worked through that.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm kind of a unicorn in the apologetics world, and that my answer kind of to this, I think, is no. Like, I can't remember a time in which I seriously struggled with doubt and had to work through it, which is often what leads a lot of people into the apologetics world when they're challenged by some professor, or they're challenging themselves. And then it causes them to get into apologetics and kind of fall in love with it. For me, I think it's slightly different. Is I can go back and see times in my life where people raised huge apologetic objections to me when I was in college, and it just kind of man, I don't know about that, and I brush it off. For me, what I often say is my biggest area of doubt is what I just mentioned before about that experiential faith path and the evidential faith path. Is that my struggle, if I want to call it, it's not like some existential thing. I'm not in the serious issue of doubt, but my struggle is, when I pray, I feel like I'm talking in an empty room. I don't feel like God is listening. And there's times where I'm praying. It's like, God, are you there? Like, I feel like kind of like in the Psalms where Dan is like, Lord, where are you? Like, come on, like, hear me. Like, why aren't you answering, sort of thing? And so like, it's in those times where if I'm not careful, I kind of switch into that experiential faith path. I base my truth on what I experience. I'm not experiencing God in that moment. It feels like I'm talking to this empty room. Therefore I am, God's not there. And I just, in that times, I quickly just switch back and I go, God, I know you're there. Your word says very clearly, like you hear us when we're praying and you answer prayers and you're there, and so I come back. And so I wouldn't say it's like some doubt that I'm really struggling with, but that is the area where I go, man, that's the biggest area when it happens, is the times where I'm like, God, are you really there? Like, come on, like, kind of that hiddenness, something like, can you not just give me a little bit more and show me that you're there? But again, I quickly just go, I know that though is not the determining factor for truth. There's good reason to believe this. And so I continue trusting. So yeah, I'm kind of weird in the sense that I don't have that kind of big doubt journey like a lot of Christian apologists do. For me, It's mainly seeing the doubts and the struggles and the students walking away that I got into this for care for other people, not necessarily because it happened to me.
Yeah, I don't think everyone needs to have that sort of moment of doubt. And it may be that in the future there could be something, that you work through. Yeah. Lord willing, he just helps us to be rooted and established in the faith and recognize that that we trust him, not in the way of what some would term as the God of gaps, where whenever we just don't understand something, we just say, well, just trust God and everything will be okay. Theologically, we know that is true, but ultimately it could be the curse of a lazy Christian. But I think what you're expressing is true of our relationships. You're married and, you've got a child, one child, correct?
Yep. Two on the way. Another one on the way.
Okay. It's like, wow, two. Congratulations.
Not twins. Number two is on the way.
Maybe it's prophetic. I know in relationships, with my wife, with my children now, I've got older children, I've got 4. Sometimes we can assume something about somebody else, about a relationship, like you said, based on feelings. And sometimes I have the same feeling is I would love to, just go to the mount and say, Lord, talk to me. And he could just give me commandments and I could just, continue on with my day. I'd know exactly what the will of God is for me that day, who I need to talk to, what I need to do. But the reality is it doesn't seem to have made too much of a difference for those in the Old Testament versus those of us today who are real blessed to have a completed Word of God that, we don't have to climb up the mount again and ask God the question. If we didn't listen the first time, we've got a completed revelation. We have the opportunity to see what God has told us. We have an opportunity to see the will of God for us. All of us have a very common purpose. And I think that there's a lot of comfort in that. And that's something that, for some, they didn't have. And I'm thankful for that. But you're right. Sometimes our feelings can escape us. Now, as we kind of close here, just a final question. I wonder, do you have any advice for Christians who would like to engage in conversations with people who don't believe in God? Because there are some that are watching that may know somebody. It might even, the hardest conversations are with people that we know very well. It could be a sibling, a friend that we've grown up with, or maybe someone's in school right now in college and they're sitting next to someone and they care for them and they're struggling. How would you advise someone to speak to them about God, about especially getting down to the Lord Jesus Christ?
Yeah. Man, that's so big. There's a analogy or a chart, or I don't know what you're gonna call it, a picture in a book, and I'm trying to think what book. It's one of Sean McDowell's books. I think it's the one he wrote with J. Warner Wallace. I forget, but it's the worldview triangle, and how it structures. At the top is our actions, And it talks about how if you want to have change someone's behaviors or their actions, well, your behavior is influenced by your values. So what you value is then going to shape your behaviors. If you value having fun, you're going to behave in a way that allows you to have more fun. If you value school, you're going to spend more time studying. And so your values determine or influence your behaviors. But what determines your values is your worldview. Your worldview is going to tell you what is valuable, and then that leads to your behaviors. And they have at the very bottom of the triangle, the thing that influences and shapes someone's worldview is relationships. That our worldview and our beliefs are shaped within the context of relationship. And so my thought on this is that sometimes we as Christians can come across and see the person that we're talking to as maybe like a project, maybe like, hey, I'm going to have my goal. And, we have this kind of conversation at Maven where these sort of things have happened, where someone will come contact us and say, I talked to the Mormons like you trained me to do. They came over to my house 2 times. They said that they weren't convinced. And so I just told them, look, this is a waste of time. You're never going to convince me that Mormonism is true. Clearly, you're not going to be convinced that Christianity is true. And so I'm done having this conversation. And we often will kind of come back and say, well, hold on a second. Like, would you walk away from Christianity after like 2 30-minute conversations? That's it? Like, what do we expect? And so I think part of it is changing our expectations of what we hope to get out of this person, how quick we want God to work and the Holy Spirit to call them. And it's like, man, if you don't become a Christian and accept what I'm saying in 1 or 2 times we sit down, then I give up. And I think that's why I encourage, like, focus on relationship. If it's done in a relational way, it's not like, okay, after 2 conversations, I'm done with you and I'm going to go move on to the next person to try to become more successful. It's like, if it's a relationship, you're in for the long haul. And so then you'd bring up things naturally. Then it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like you're forcing Christianity upon them, but you're able to bring up conversations. And when it's within the context of relationship, and you become someone that they see as an authority or someone that they respect your opinion on stuff, then when they see something in culture that seems weird, they might come to you and say, hey, what is your view on this? And this is my kind of, right now, it's kind of my issue with what I see Christians doing online, is that we talk in a way in comment sections and with each other when we're in person, as if no one from the outside or as if no one from a different perspective, whether worldview, religious, or political perspective, is listening. And we kind of joke and mock people from another side, to where I think, man, if anyone was here that was listening to this that actually held to those things, like the way that we talk about homosexuals, if anyone there that was struggling with same-sex attraction, are they really going to want to go talk to you? The way we joke and kind of mock the gender dysphoria and gender identity conversation, it's like, man, if someone in that room was actually struggling with gender dysphoria, would they know that you're a person that they could trust to go to get advice on a biblical view of gender? Or would they be afraid that you're just going to mock it? It's like, and so that sort of thing. And I've had Christians talk to me and mock and make fun of theological views that I hold, and they didn't know that I held them. And they're like, can you believe that some Christians think this? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know how you'd feel if you found out that I'm one of those Christians that think that. And so I think that's one of those things, is like watching how we speak, watching the jokes that we make, not knowing what someone around us actually believes, thinks, or is experiencing, and being people that truly are showing the love and compassion of Christ. That doesn't mean you can't say something is sin or you can't speak truth. We're called to do that, right? I'm not saying to give up those things, but be someone who truly shows the love of Christ, to where people see us as a respectful person, to where when they have issues, they will come to us. But then also that within the context of relationship, we can just slowly be forming the way that they view, kind of be challenging them and pushing back. And that's one thing I love about teaching high school, is that I'm with these students 3 to 4 days a week, forming those relationships. And it's hard not to have an influence on them when I'm with them that much time. And I think so that part of it is relationship, build relationships with people. I just saw a TikTok video where this guy, Sean McDowell, responded to it, but where this guy said, I would never be friends with an atheist. And Sean's like, man, that's sad. That's really sad that you would never be friends with an atheist. But then so relationship, I think, is huge. And then just changing our expectation. It's like, if they don't become a Christian within a week, are you going to give up? Or is the expectation you have, kind of like Greg Koukl talks about in Tactics, just put a stone in their shoe, put a pebble in their shoe, get them thinking, because thinking about Jesus is worth it. And it might be a slow transition, but if you're moving slowly down the line, closer and closer to Jesus and making that progress, that's awesome. If there's a time where it kind of reverses a little bit, okay, you kind of got pushed back, but kind of keep pushing forward, because we're in this for the long haul. So stamina, encouragement, keep going, because what you do is worth it. And ultimately, I think, look, if you are having these sort of conversations, trying to push people towards Christ, there's nothing better that we can do.